Well, friends, can I welcome you all to this very special evening where we will be focusing very much on the issue of the recruitment of 16-year-olds to the armed service. Many of you will know the distinctive legacy of the United Kingdom. That is one of the few nations in Europe that allows that to happen. So we will have, I think, time to listen. We were supposed to have Ben Griffin with us, but as you can see, this is good Bryn weather tonight at its most ferocious. And because of that, we've not been able to have him with us tonight, because mainly because of the weather. So apologies for that. But Owen is with us, and Owen is from, as some of you will know, from ForcesWatch, and he has a bit of Ben's notes, and he will share some of that with us during this evening. And as well as listening, I hope very, very much that we'll have an opportunity to share with each other and to discuss some of the issues, and possibly to ask Owen some of the questions later on. Can I just tell you a little bit about some of the things that I do? My work is, I'm Chief Executive of Cytun, Churches Together in Wales, and I also serve the interfaith community as the Secretary of the Interfaith Council for Wales. Many of our faith communities here in Wales feel passionately around issues of peace. We have Welsh-speaking churches, Eglwys Sifil yr Annibynwyr Cymraeg. We also, as you would well know, have communities such as the Quaker community. I know through Dewi and others of the passion of the Unitarian community here in Wales too. But we are here tonight to people from different faiths and of none. All of us reflecting on the value and on the challenge of what happens when you entice 16-year-olds to become soldiers. I've had the privilege of working with Dewi and others in the arena of serving Welsh refugee communities. And what I do find, looking at the global scene and some of the narratives that I've listened to over the past 10 years or so, of what happens when you make boys into soldiers, and the damage that that causes, and the terrible tyranny of forcing what is children to fight in wars. We know as well from places such as the Congo and others of what happens to women at the hand of soldiers. Very, very young soldiers. And I think possibly we may tonight need to reflect on what happens, not only because of what happens in the UK, but perhaps the message that that gives to the global community. And perhaps we will reflect on those themes tonight. Many faiths will believe strongly and passionately in the value and the sacredness of life. Many of the faith communities that I serve will have an absolute view that it is wrong for anyone to kill. It is particularly wrong to compel or to entice the young to kill. And that's a particular faith value that my faith communities, many of them, will have. And perhaps we can reflect on those values and on those faith imperatives as we hold conversation with each other later on. But we will focus tonight, I'm sure, on the issue of our schools here in the UK and here also in Wales, because we do know that there are high levels of recruitment to the armed services from here in Wales. And that is very much of an issue and part of our cultural experience and our history here. But that's enough for me. Dyna ddigon gen I. Mi wahoddai Owen i'r gair o safbwynt ForcesWatch. I'll ask Owen to say a word about his experiences and his campaigning through ForcesWatch, and perhaps also to make reference, if you would, Owen, to some of the thoughts that Ben would have shared with you. But croeso bawb, welcome everyone. Thank you.
The minimum age of UK Armed Forces recruitment should be raised to 18, and questioning the military's influence on Welsh schools. And I hope that I'll make it obvious that those two are very linked, and that this is very much a Welsh issue as much as a UK-wide issue. Just very briefly on myself and ForcesWatch. So ForcesWatch was set up in 2010, and the kind of main aim of ForcesWatch is to scrutinise recruitment practice by the UK military and raise questions about whether it's in the best interest of young people. That's kind of at the heart of our work. We have three main project areas that we work on under that. The first is this advocacy work, trying to get the age of recruitment, the minimum age of recruitment, raised to 18 from 16. The second is looking at education and the way that the armed forces and military approaches are present and being actually increased in the UK education system, particularly in secondary schools and colleges. And our third area, which is the most recent and the kind of biggest in a way, is generally looking at the ways that the military is becoming more visible, or military approaches are being turned to more and more in different areas of society. So not just education, but that's a big area of it. Also local communities through the community covenants, the way the military is represented in the media, military charities, military in public spaces, lots and lots of different areas. So that's our kind of third and most ambitious area of work in a way. So the main question tonight really is, why raise the age of recruitment to 18? What's the issue? And there's a lot of factors. I just want to start off though by getting a show of hands to see, where people stand at the beginning of this evening, and then I'll do it again at the end and see if anyone's changed their mind. So can I ask, and don't feel obliged, if you prefer to keep your views private, that's fine, but if you're willing to say, put your hand up if you are in favour of the age of recruitment into the armed forces being raised to 18. Okay, so that's pretty strongly in favour. Anyone who say they would not like it to be raised, they think it should stay at 16? And then any abstentions or not sures? Okay, thank you. So I'll do that again. Hopefully I won't have turned anyone the other way. I am here on behalf of an organisation that strongly believes it should be raised to 18, and I also personally think that. So we'll see. So there are many reasons why the age of recruitment should be raised. Some of them are about child rights and the best interests of young people, and some of them are more about cost and operational questions. So some of them would be considered more ethical, and some would be really more in the interest perhaps of the Ministry of Defence and the government. I want to touch on all of them. So, first of all, the current situation is that you can start the process of application to the armed forces at 15. You can join at 16. The vast majority of people joining at 16 into the armed forces are going to the army. 91.5% in the most recent year, 2012-2013. That was 2,300 16 and 17-year-olds joining that year, as opposed to only 210 to the Navy and RAF. So bear that in mind. This isn't, although it's about all of the armed forces, it's particularly about the army in a big way. So you can join at 16. You can't be deployed, and this is a quote from the Ministry of Defence, on operations where hostile forces are involved until you're 18. Okay? They claim that that is compatible with the optional protocol on the rights of the child, which is a UN protocol signed by the vast majority of UN member states, which states that volunteer minors are okay in the armed forces at the age of 16 and 17 if they do not take a direct part in hostilities. So the MOD have interpreted that as not being deployed on operations where hostile forces are involved. So they go through a rigorous period of training for 2 years if they're joining at 16, and once they turn 18 they can be immediately deployed into a war zone. However, incredibly, there have been quite a number of accidental deployments of minors into war zones. So between 2003 and April 2013, at least 20 16 and 17-year-olds were deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq accidentally. One of them was in Helmand province for 6 weeks, and he took part in fighting there. The MOD, in response to this, when this was revealed, said that it was down to pressures on units at times of deployment. But I just think that's quite amazing, and something to bear in mind. So even though, in theory, they're not being deployed to war zones, they're very much being prepared for it, and some actually have accidentally been sent out to these places. Right, the child rights case to start off with. So, it's quite fair to say, we think, that this situation is inconsistent with what we generally consider to be the legal age of adult responsibility. So for the majority of things, we talk about 18 as being the age, for example, when you can smoke, drink alcohol, watch an adult film, or perhaps most crucially, sign a legal contract. However, the armed forces contracts that these young people are signing, if they're joining at 16 and 17 with their parents, are somehow distinguished from this. These contracts just commit them to the first month of training, so you have to absolutely do that. You can't leave in the first 28 days. And they're also committed to military law. So whilst they can't sign a legal contract until they're 18, they can sign a contract that commits them to the unique nature of military law, which can include imprisonment in a military facility, for example, if you go absent without leave. And the most recent figures we got for that are that in 2010, 10 young people, 10 minors, were in a military prison in Colchester for going absent without leave. So that shows that that's an issue, a big issue. There's been a recent change. So now, if you're joining a 16 or a 17-year-old, you can leave up until the age of 18. That didn't used to be the case. So up until 2011, you had a small window of a few months when you joined at 16, and after that you'd be committed till you're 22. And we called that catch-22. So that is a positive that that's been removed. So now, if you apply in writing to your commanding officer, you have, with 3 months' notice, you can then leave up until the age of 18. In theory, no questions asked. If you join within 6 months of your 18th birthday, you then have this kind of 6-month period under which you can leave. So, for example, if you join at 17 years and 10 months, you can still leave up until the 4th month of your after your 18th birthday, if that makes sense. So it's more restrictive if you're joining towards your 18th birthday, but you've still got this window. However, it's really important to note that recruitment forms are very complicated. Secondly, there's no obligation for recruiters to have any correspondence with the parents of these minors. Usually the forms are signed at home, and usually recruits have, into the army, recruits have a very low reading age. The most recent research, which is quite a few years old, it's about 10 years old, suggested that the average age of an army recruit was 10, average reading age. And actually the minimum requirement by the army is 7, a reading age of 7. So if you combine the complicated forms, potential sort of lack of awareness by the parents, and the low reading age, it could mean that really they're not understanding these obligations, which is obviously very problematic. There's evidence that this is an issue as well from the websites such as beforeyousignup.info, which tries to offer impartial advice to young people thinking about signing up, and they're getting a lot of requests, people saying, you know, I don't get this, I don't get that, what does it all mean? So that's part of the child rights problem. And then of course, although you can in theory leave up until the age of 18, the army, the armed forces, the army in particular, are not going to let them go easily, because it's a big investment that they're putting into these young people, so there will certainly be pressure to stay in one way or another. So that's also important to bear in mind. Since 2002, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Defence Select Committee of the UK government, and the Joint Committee on Human Rights have all called on the government to conduct an inquiry or a review of the policy of recruiting minors. So there's pressure coming from different angles. However, as I said, the MOD claim that they're acting perfectly in compliance with this optional protocol. They're not doing anything contrary to international law, and therefore, why do they need to do a review? Then, under child rights still, there's the question of education. So in 2009-2010, 94% of 16-year-olds in the UK stayed in education rather than seeking employment. So the vast majority of young people are carrying on in education. What the armed forces offer for minors who are leaving education is a very inadequate education. So the army don't offer GCSEs. They offer, for example, NVQs, which a recent report on vocational education said just aren't the same in terms of their rigour and their employability as GCSEs. And actually the only formal qualification you will have to get in the army if you're joining as a minor is equivalent to GCSE grade G in literacy and numeracy. So like very, very low educational standards. It's fair to say that the Navy and the RAF do actually offer better educational opportunities, But as I said at the beginning, it's very few young people, minors, that are joining those services. And also, they tend to have a higher level of qualifications than those joining the army. So educational provision is very poor. Then, one of the biggest cases, probably the one that I personally would emphasise the most, is the higher risks of being in the armed forces for those that join at 16 or 17. Higher risk in terms of risk of being killed, in terms of mental health problems, in terms of bullying and sexual harassment. And also, they've got this obligation to be in the reserves when they do leave the regular armed forces. So that kind of risk is continued. It doesn't just stop when they leave, because there's the potential that they'll be recalled at any time to do service in any part of the world. So in terms of the risk of fatality, risk of being killed, in Afghanistan, soldiers who enlisted at 16 were twice as likely to be killed than those joining at 18. Okay, twice as likely to be killed. There's probably a similar ratio for non-fatal injuries. We haven't got enough evidence to say that completely 100% with confidence, but there's a strong correlation between fatality rates and non-fatal injury rates. So probably they're significantly more likely to get non-fatal injuries as well as be killed. Then in terms of mental health, this one's slightly harder to talk about because there are very few studies that actually distinguish members of the armed forces who joined at 16 or 17. But we can say with confidence that the experts agree that it's a sliding scale. The younger recruits always are most at risk of mental health problems for various reasons, lack of psychological maturity for one. The evidence that we do have really supports this, and ForcesWatch have done a very good report on this, which I'll talk about later. So for example, Iraq veterans in 2008 were screened for post-traumatic stress disorder, or like whether they had that or not. And the under 25s age group, the youngest age group, had 5.7 of the under 25s age group were screened positive for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, whereas only 2.6% of the 40-plus age group, the oldest age group, screened positive for it. This youngest age group is also PTSD is also 4 times more likely amongst those with the highest childhood adversity. And what I mean by childhood adversity is there are 16 indicators of childhood adversity, one of them, for example, being whether they've experienced violence at home, another being whether they've been in trouble with the police. And the way of saying whether someone's got high childhood adversity is whether they score 6 of these 16 factors. So those that have had high childhood adversity are 4 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder when they're in the armed forces. And then 2 times more likely if you've got no GCSEs as opposed to those with A-levels. And all of this is correlating with those 16 and 17-year-olds that are joining the army, who are the vast majority of the minors joining the armed forces. They tend to have very low qualifications, often from very disadvantaged backgrounds, and they're the most likely to get post-traumatic stress disorder when they're out in war zones. If you compare it to their civilian counterparts, that's again really revealing. So the youngest group in the armed forces are 3 times more likely to drink to a harmful level than the equivalent age group in the civilian population. They're also around 3 times more likely to commit suicide once they leave the armed forces than the equivalent group in the civilian population. Then, as I mentioned, there's also a higher risk of bullying and sexual harassment being experienced of the female recruits primarily. And all of this is really because, and this is really crucial, they're overrepresented in the sections of the armed forces that are most exposed to traumatic incidents in warfare. So as I said, they're mostly overwhelmingly in the army, and of that, the majority are in the infantry. So the infantry makes up around a quarter of the army, but a third of the army's minors are in the infantry. And the infantry has a 6 times higher fatality rate than other sections of the army. And similarly, if you look at post-traumatic stress disorder rates, the infantry has a 6% rate, as opposed to 4.8% in the army generally, as opposed to 2.8% in the navy, and just 2.5% in the RAF. So again, it's this unevenness. The youngest, most disadvantaged recruits are overrepresented in the most dangerous parts of the armed forces, hence they're most exposed to the risks, the real downsides of being in the armed forces. So that's the risk. And then there's the cost. And this isn't an argument I personally, if I'm completely honest, care so much about, but it's one of the arguments that is most strong with the powers that be. Up to £94 million, it's up to £94 million more expensive to hire minors than to train adults each year. So that's a massive expense, and the reason is that it's almost double the cost of training each individual, because it's a much longer training process and because the dropout rate is much higher among minors. So with minors, you have about a 37% dropout rate each year, as opposed to adults, which is only 28%. To schools with a recruitment purpose were ended. Okay, so that's the petition, and this petitions committee has met several times to look at the issue, and they've received, at their meeting in December 2013, they agreed to consider the correspondence that they'd seen and to summarise their views at a future meeting. So there's one more meeting to come, and we're trying to influence that decision as much as possible to make it a real impactful one. But just to give you an idea of what they discussed and what they've been told in their evidence sessions, they wrote to the Ministry of Defence saying, come on, tell us about this visits to Welsh schools. Why are poorer schools being visited, for example? Is it recruitment? And the MOD replied quite predictably, no, we don't go into schools for recruitment purposes, and no, we only go if we're invited, specifically by teacher or schools. They also cited a survey which said that 74% of people interviewed thought that the army gave impartial careers advice. But actually, when you look at the data for that, as much data as we've got, only 3% of the respondents were from Wales, so it's hardly a fair representation of what people in Wales think. And also, I just find it incredible that anyone can think anyone's offering impartial careers advice if they're going in to talk about themselves as a career. So that's really dubious. Careers Wales were also written to by the Petitions Committee, and they said, quite rightly, we don't organise these visits, it's the armed forces and the schools that do it. But whatever we do is always about making sure that young people are making an informed decision about their career, ideally with a careers advisor, an independent careers advisor. So what we've done in response to, actually no, I'll say that in a sec. And lastly, the Petitions Committee members visited a school in Wales to see what pupils and teachers thought about the armed forces visits, a school that gets quite a lot of visits from the army. And some of the pupils made some really good points. They recognised that there was an agenda. It wasn't something for nothing. But some of them also thought, it's fine, what's the problem? I'm interested in joining the army, my dad's in the army. So there was a mixture of opinions. ForcesWatch then wrote to the Petitions Committee in response to all of this, saying, first of all, well, here's why the MOD are not being completely frank about the not doing it for recruitment and only doing it when they're invited. Secondly, we said, Careers Wales have got some good points. It'd be fantastic if they, or someone else, could write to schools, head teachers, giving them guidance basically about how to deal with armed forces visits, saying, okay, if you have decided on balance you think this is valuable to your students, you have a duty in loco parentis to be making sure they're having a really good discussion afterwards or before about the positives and negatives of joining the armed forces. That is by no means just one side of the view being put across. And then about the visit to the school, well, we just said basically one school. You can't sort of represent Welsh students and teachers' views by visiting one school. That's completely insufficient. So we wait to hear on the kind of final conclusions of the Petitions Committee, but we certainly hope to get something thoughtful and critical from them, and hopefully offering guidance to schools about what to do about these armed forces visits. Right, that's me done for now. I've got the bit to read from Ben, but maybe I could do that a bit later. Or
okay, that'd be
now.
good. It might be good to have a little conversation, just in case we lose track on what Owen has said.
Yeah.
May I ask, well, may I invite questions? Please keep them as much as you can short. And I know this is bad news from a preacher, but no sermons, please.
Propaganda campaign around Polish soldiers' heroes, which it's such a picture of history when military celebrate. I've never seen the last decade. Right? I was even a pub there, and there was a poster up saying, buy a drink for a hero, or this kind of thing. This kind of happened. It seems in this military recruitment campaign has been, because they know the wars are unpopular, they've separated off the issue of military recruitment and the issues of the wars that people serving, but in order to actually rehabilitate the wars. So I think campaigning against it, I think we do have to emphasize the point, well, actually people most people don't hate the war in Afghanistan, what happened in Iraq. And so why should the military be aggressively recruiting one moratorium on military recruit while Britain
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, take another.
Yeah. All really good points. Thank you. So in terms of engagement with pupils in more privileged areas, absolutely. To be crude, the armed forces is a very classist institution. The majority of those in other ranks, so non-officer ranks, are from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and the overwhelming majority of officers, commissioned officers, are from more privileged backgrounds, largely graduates, middle class. And that is evident just if you listen to the accents, where people are from, and how people speak. So a lot of the activities that are going on in more privileged schools, such as the combined cadet forces, which are overwhelmingly in private schools, and of course visits are happening to private schools as well, that will have an officer focus. So they're going to be more likely to be plugging these university bursaries. You go through your degree, we'll pay you, and then you become an officer for a few years. So there is a kind of, it's important to note the difference between those approaches. But interesting to hear about the military prep course, because I hadn't heard about that before. The Military Ethos in Schools programme that a friend mentioned is something I didn't touch on today, because currently it's only happening in England and in English state schools, given the Welsh sort of autonomy over education. But it may be copied here, and that would be interesting and concerning. Basically, it covers a variety of schemes. One of them is called Troops to Teachers, which fast tracks former military people into teaching jobs. You can become a teacher as a non-graduate through that scheme, which is very controversial. Schools get paid to take these teachers, so that's one part of it. There's alternative provision with a military ethos, and again, as you pointed out, this basically is talking about skills that are presented as being uniquely or exclusively present in the military, and that the military best provide, or military personnel best provide these skills. So self-discipline, teamwork, leadership. Another is the expansion of the combined cadet force into state schools. So I said it's largely been in private schools in the past, but there's a big drive to expand it in state schools. So these various initiatives are growing in England at the moment, not without problems and not without debate. So we don't know yet how big it's going to become. But that is actually our biggest focus at the moment, is questioning that, because there's a lot of assumptions behind it and a lot of flimsy evidence that really needs to be challenged, whether it's really in the best interest of the pupils, or is it actually, as we suspect, largely driven by recruitment and employing veterans, which is a crucial thing that the Ministry of Defence have to do, remains to be seen. And lastly, you kind of touched on what we would call militarisation more broadly. I mentioned at the beginning that that's one of the three areas that ForcesWatch work on, this kind of massive sprawling issue of how the military itself, or a military approach, is being privileged in many different areas of society. And this is a very concerted, deliberate, top-down process that's happening. And it's happened since about 2008, when Gordon Brown commissioned a study called the Report of Inquiry into the National Recognition of Our Armed Forces. And basically that report said there's a big problem, the wars are unpopular, we're struggling to recruit, and people just don't know enough about the armed forces, or they don't feel a personal connection, or they don't feel enough support for them. And so it made loads of recommendations, and a lot of these have been implemented. So we've got the Armed Forces Covenant and the Community Covenants, which are now signed by almost all the local authorities in the UK, which provide grants for special activities around the armed forces. We've got Armed Forces Day, which happens each year and is getting bigger each year. Increased funding for the schools initiatives, so various things that are happening at the same time as we see a massive kind of unpopularity of the wars. There's a growing popularity of the armed forces. And while some of this is understandable and not something that necessarily needs to be criticised, you've got to recognise the political calculation here, which is, as the armed forces become above criticism more and more, the wars become more palatable. And that's something the Ministry of Defence is really, really concerned about. How can we prosecute a future war? Given the vote on Libya, what can we do? So this stuff is growing, and it's something we all kind of need to be aware of and question.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we now go, if we may? I thank everybody for their questions and their contributions. Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi. Ben should have been here tonight, and some of you will know his story and his narrative, but he is a veteran, I believe, from the SAS, if I remember, and he's had a very distinctive change of mind and change of value base around the issue. And I think you're going to...
But by way of announcements, there are two forthcoming meetings in the next 2 months. Our next meetings are on Thursday the 27th of March. There is our annual general meeting, which will be in this room, probably at the other end of the room, at 5:30. And then at 7 o'clock we have a visiting speaker called Vijay Mehta, who is the author of the book The Economics of Killing. And this is in fact to talk about the military-industrial complex, of which we've heard a little bit about kinetic this evening. He is coming along together with loudspeakers and slides to show. So that's on Thursday the 27th of March. The other event is on Tuesday the 8th of April, and it's a meeting about United Nations reform. We were hoping that Ben was actually going to bring along some booklets about this, which we would have distributed tonight if so, but that of course hasn't happened. The speaker is Dr. Edwin Egede of the Law Faculty of Cardiff University, and he knows about international law and structure of the United Nations, and so he has agreed to talk about United Nations reform, following some of the ideas from these Erskine Childers, which are discussed in that particular book. So please make a note of both March the 27th and April the 8th. We have a whole panoply of further meetings ahead of us, but probably that's enough to mention for the present.
Okay, thank you. Well, friends, can I thank you for a very productive evening? I've certainly learnt a great deal, not only from the questions and the contributions on the floor, but very, very much so from Owen. We're very, very grateful to you for that. And also to get that snapshot from Ben. And can I thank everybody who's organised tonight? I'm not quite sure who they all are, do we? But you will know who they are. And we're very, very grateful for that. And I wish you well. And above all, with this foul weather, I wish you all a safe journey back home. Is there anything else, or are we okay?
Just to mention once again, we've got this petition here. If you haven't signed it online or in paper copy, if you do think the age of recruitment should be raised to 18, please do sign it. The more signatures we get, the more chance it's got of having some sway. And remember, I've got leaflets here for people to take military activities in schools and ForcesWatch stuff. And if anyone has any questions or would like to get in touch, please come up this evening.
Se non ti cade mai